Thank you, Neil. We will begin now with our responders. Dan, do you want to start?
I would like to just say one short thing, and that is that yesterday my company, Urbanor, took a bunch of hazardous materials that we collect incidentally to our reuse function to an authorized disposal place in Oakland. And there we paid over $900 to get rid of about 10 or so categories of different sorts of hazardous materials, including fluorescent light bulbs and solvents and some pesticides, etc. We get those sorts of things just because they come in boxes and sometimes we can't control. But we ended up paying for it. Now that is what is known as a disposal service fee in the industry, and in the entire industry of recycling is based on disposal service fees plus product sales. Some of these materials we actually turned in might even be recyclable, and they might even bring a pretty good price at some point if they're cleaned up. But the fact is that that's the way this system works. PPI and now Upstream has created its problems for itself by initially saying you can't do that. You can't charge. Everything's got to be free. And that's why they want the producers to come up with money, and then somehow or other through a very difficult process, the money gets down to the collectors like us. But it doesn't, and it hasn't. And so that's basically what I see happening. There's a lot more to be said here, I'm sorry to say, and not enough time to say it, but I would like to defer to Mary Lou as the next speaker, because she has been keeping up with and is on the board of directors of an association in British Columbia that's at the forefront of the fight against EPR. These are bottle depot people who were there before EPR was ever even a thought in anybody's head, even in Sweden. And now we are up there fighting incineration and fighting all sorts of other things, and I think Mary Lou is the one to talk about that. So I would prefer to just pass my time on to her. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dan. So, Maurice, am I on then?
Yes. Yeah, I believe so, yes.
You're on.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Dan. Yes, I'm sorry, I forgot to put into my little thumbnail bio there that I am on the board of directors. I'm the only international member of the board of directors of the BC BDRA, which is the British Columbia Bottle Depot and Recycling Association. So I'm sorry to disappoint Matt, who really doesn't want to waste our time discussing British Columbia, but I just went up there last month for a meeting of the BC BDRA, and I have to say, here are some thumbnail updates from British Columbia, which is, like the rest of Canada, entirely devoted to EPR for everything. And British Columbia has implemented EPR aggressively. And last year, they put into place a stewardship operation, a stewardship scheme, a plan for packaging, printed paper, and plastics. And the results are catastrophic. The thing about EPR is that the costs are invisible because the costs are incorporated into the purchase price of a product. People think that recycling is free. They think that all disposal is free except landfilling, but it's of course not true. Everything costs something. But now the stewards are in place, and I'll just talk about packaging because everybody agrees apparently on toxics, which is wonderful. But for packaging, I have seen some of these contracts, and the first draft contract from the stewardship organization was to use the word forbidden when it discussed reuse. So that was upsetting to people, so they finally permitted reuse, but at best they discourage it, and in point of fact it is de facto prohibited. For example, we know one recycler who wants to sell things for reuse, and when people bring things in, he used to say, oh, well, I can reuse this, so I'll put it off in the reuse store. No, the stewards now say, no, you can only reuse something if the person who brings it to you specifically requests that it be reused. So the operator, the processor, the collector, nobody can make that decision. If the person who brings it in messes up and doesn't ask for it to be reused. There have been successful recycling operations that have been completely upended. When the previously, British Columbia used to have a very good recycling system for packaging and paper, but it's entirely been upended. So marginal businesses have been put under. One women's shelter, a nonprofit women's shelter that used to rely on recycling as a funding source, now has to use its grant funding to subsidize the recycling, which is not the intended outcome. The administrative nightmare is hard to describe. Every covered product has a separate contract. Many of the contracts are short-term, usually annual, and sometimes then they go month to month. Now you can't use those kinds of contracts for financing anything. Matt mentioned increased money coming in from producers' fees, but not in British Columbia. In British Columbia, the producer requires the recycler or processor to finance absolutely everything. So you're required very often to make capital investments in your operation in order to get the contract from the producer, from the stewardship organization. But your capital investment is not your requirement to do capital investment is not considered in the contracts because they're short-term, and you can't use the contracts for financing if you need financing. There was one guy a month and a half ago. This guy has been processing recyclables and especially bottles and paper for like 15 years, but about a month and a half ago, the steward and he invested heavily in a facility expansion when the packaging coverage began last year. But about 6 weeks ago, he had his contract canceled, and he wasn't even told. His clients were told before he was told himself. He went to pick up his client's material, and the client said, well, your material isn't ready because you don't have the contract anymore. And that was how he found out that he had lost his contract after 15 years in business. There are many, many recyclers who, there was one guy who was told he had lost his processing contract. He was given 2 weeks' notice before he lost his contract, but that contract provided 60% of his income. So he had 2 weeks' notice. That's not even good firing notice, really, if your plant is closing down. So, and now the financial hardships continue because recyclers used to be able to sell their collected materials to the market, but now they must sell to the monopsony. Now, a monopsony is a monopoly marketplace. It's a purchasing marketplace. And that's what the stewardship organizations become. And they dictate what they will pay. And they pay exactly the same thing to everybody, no matter whether you're 3 minutes away from their receiving dock or whether you're 500 miles away from their receiving dock. They pay you exactly the same per pound price. So if you're rural, you had better figure out how to absorb a lot more costs than you used to have to. Recently, in the last like 8 weeks, or no, maybe 3 months, the steward has decided to send packaging that's collected by curbside programs. Instead of sending it to some recyclers, they're sending it to other recyclers. They have engaged a plastic processing facility to take some of the bottles that the other processing facilities used to get, and there's a bottle deposit in British Columbia. So the processor gets the bottle deposit, but now the stewards are removing those bottles from the materials that the processors are receiving, and those bottles are going to a plastics company. And the list just kind of goes on. You know, it's very difficult. The recycler's income fell because the monopsony is a middleman. The monopoly has split recyclers apart by being divisive. They restrict the information because all the information about tonnage collected belongs to the stewards. You know, when you hand over the recycling industry to a monopoly, you hand over control. So as Matt says, yes, it's about money, and it's about control, and it's about being treated like a person instead of a serf. So that's my report from British Columbia. Sorry to have bored everybody with British Columbia, but up there, I just have to say they're dying. Thank you very much, and I don't want to take Dick Lilly's time.
Mary Lou has certainly listed all of the disadvantages of the British Columbia system that both Matt and I have been working against for a long time. So I want to assure you that it's not the kind of system that either politically or practically would work in the United States. The monopsony is not workable. But to go back to the main issues surrounding EPR, they are several and important. One, speaking, and I want to remind everybody, I no longer speak officially for the city of Seattle. I've been retired for about 4 months. So all of these thoughts are unofficial and can be taken only as mine. One is that we are a highly, Seattle is recycles at a very high rate, and we have reached a point where, in my view, pay as you throw is about to go upside down. In other words, we actually have so little garbage against which we charge our ratepayers that the ratepayers are subsidizing and always have subsidized quote-unquote free recycling in excess of $16 million a year off the garbage bills. So the elasticity of pay-as-you-throw is probably reaching its limits in the high-performing cities, which means that the whole industry needs to look for additional funding sources, since politically it's unlikely that we can shift much more to the ratepayers. The other thing that's happening is a dramatic change in materials coming into MRFs that make it harder and harder to make MRFs pay, and that means that renewed contracts by municipalities with their MRFs also are being driven higher and higher, and a greater burden on ratepayers. The packaging changes we're seeing are really affecting this. But the real important thing here in any discussion of increasing recycling is to look at it through the greenhouse gas lens. And the major function of recycling and greenhouse gas is to move materials which are not reused and not reusable. I'm granting that reuse is the primary thing here. No problem with that. But to move the materials that are not recapturable in reuse to the remanufacture or into commercial use for remanufacturing to make new products, because the interception or the interdiction of the use of virgin materials is the major way in which recycling can reduce greenhouse gas. And if we don't take that step, I think we're just missing the boat on that particular opportunity to reduce greenhouse gas. And in order to do that, we need to look in terms of greater efficiency of MRFs, greater efficiency of secondary processors, and one of the great roles that EPR can play is it can be set up to build the producers, or to get the producers in a position where the money collected is sufficient to provide for the capital improvements needed to make better MRFs and better secondary processing to recapture higher and higher levels of material at higher and higher qualities. So that's what I think the real importance is of EPR. This is a great discussion. I really enjoyed it, and I think we have a long way to go in this discussion to resolve some of the issues raised by Neil and Mary Lou.
Could I just say one thing here, and that is that it seems to me, Dick, that the key issue here is how to regard what we as recyclers and reusers do. And my feeling is that we are in the disposal business, that we should have complete access to charging disposal service fees for the disposal service that we in fact provide, and that in itself is the key to expanding recycling in the face of declining waste. Here in the Bay Area, it's the same situation. Wasting can no longer pay for recycling because there isn't enough waste to do it. And so all the local governments here and all the processors and everybody else are all trying to figure out how to tell the public that recycling actually does cost money, that it can't be free. PPI took a position a long time ago that it has to be free, that the producers have to pay, and that somehow or other that's going to work, and I don't think it does. Thanks.
Let me just step in for a second here. I think it is 4 o'clock Central Time at this point. We are going to continue our conversation here among our panelists. I think that we had scheduled this so that if those listening wanted to leave, they could. But we're going to continue, especially since I think this conversation just got lit, as far as I can tell. So we're going to go. I do have a handful of questions here to come on with. So let me just say that, and why don't I just let us go with whoever wants to jump in next.
This is Neil Maurice. I'll be very brief because I do want to get to public's questions. Dick makes some good points, of course. I expect that. But my 2 points on his statements are these. The most important thing for controlling climate gas from the waste stream is to keep gas out of the landfill, which is the most polluting in terms of climate gases. And the second thing is that bottle bills are such a wonderful way to collect material. The material stays clean, the waste stream stays clean, so other materials don't get contaminated. And yet people behind EPR are the people most adamant about not having bottle bills. So I think there is this kind of schizophrenia within industry that is pushing for EPR. They say all these things. They want to reduce costs. They want to improve the climate change situation, and yet the foremost form of EPR, bottle bills, not to mention refillables, are completely discarded in any conversation with EPR, what I'll call brand name EPR advocates. And the key is that we want to keep materials that have value in our communities. We don't want them shipped out and centralized by concentrated corporations.